Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited to have you with us for Problem Solving with Smithsonian Experts. It takes place today and tomorrow, and we'll be convening again later this month for 2 more days of great interaction with our experts here at the Smithsonian. They come from a wide range of disciplines, and you'll be meeting one of them in just a moment. But before we get started, I wanted to do 2 things. The first is to give you a little background on how this environment works so that you can best enjoy your experience today. First of all, I wanted to point out that we are captioning today's event, and you should feel free to use the captions if they are useful to you, or I've put up on the screen some information on how you can turn on or off those captions using the little CC button that you'll see on your screen. I also wanted to point out that you can submit questions and comments as we go along. This conference is done live because we want to engage with each of you. And we have a lot of people online, and we may not be able to address every question that comes in, but I'll be pointing out as we go along ways to keep the dialogue going even if we don't get your question addressed. So feel free to jump in at any point. One last thing I wanted to mention on the interaction front is not only can you type your messages on the left side of the screen, but we've also have the ability for you to send your messages in via text messaging. You can send the word chat to 99503 and then just include your message after the word chat, and we'll get those messages as well. And if you are a person who likes to tweet or Twitter, you can send @poll and the word chat and your message, and we'll get those as well. There's a reminder of this in your welcome email, so you can go back and check that out as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over in one moment to Stephanie Norby, who is the convener of our conference. She's the director of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies and our great host here today. And while you meet Stephanie for a moment, we'd like to find out what brings you here, what interests you about today's topic. And I've put that question up on your screen as I turn the floor to Stephanie.
I'd like to welcome you to the 3rd Smithsonian Online Conference. I see that many of you have already introduced yourselves online, and if you haven't, I hope you'll take a few moments today to tell us about yourself. We have people joining us from all over the world who are doing very interesting work. One of the benefits of these conferences is getting to know each other. This conference is going to focus on problem solving. We're going to show you how Smithsonian experts are at work working on big, important problems across the United States and even the world. This is just a sample of the problems we tackle here at the largest museum and research complex in the world. The Smithsonian includes 19 museums and research centers around the world, and we are currently doing work in over 100 countries. During this conference, you'll be able to learn more about some of this work, have a chance to participate in online discussions and ask your own questions, and afterwards, we hope you'll visit our online exhibit halls. I'd like to thank many people who made today possible. Of course, we're grateful to all of our presenters from so many places around the Smithsonian. To my staff, in particular Stevie Engelke, who has managed this conference, and Eric Ekman, who has assisted her. To our Office of the Chief Information Officer, who partners with us and has partnered with us from the beginning on these conferences. And, of course, to Learning Times, our terrific producers. None of this would have been possible without support from Microsoft Partners in Learning. They have sponsored this event, and the collaboration will continue through their Partners in Learning network. Allison Knox from Microsoft Partners in Learning will share some ideas about how we can stay connected at the close of today's last session. Now let's get started. Today we're going to talk about problem solving and the American experience.
Thank you, Stephanie. It gives me great pleasure to start the day off with a big question. You'll be hearing lots of big questions. We won't get to all the answers during our 50 minutes with each presenter, but we're certainly going to try to address how we think about these big questions, and we're going to ask you to help us with that. And to start the day off, I'm going to introduce Paul Chaat Smith, who is the Associate Curator of the National Museum of the American Indian, an affiliation we'll talk a bit about as we turn the floor over to Paul. Paul, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Paul, what are we looking at here, and how shall we start today?
Well, I thought this image of a television test pattern would be an interesting way to start the conversation. The problem writ large that I'm trying to solve with my institution, the National Museum of the American Indian, is this contradiction of Indians particularly in the U.S., being ubiquitous and invisible at the same time. So we're ubiquitous in that Indian imagery and place names and team names and places are everywhere you look throughout the Americas, really, and especially in the U.S. And yet Indians, for the most part, were marginalized, were mostly invisible as actually a living people, part of the contemporary world. So this is something that's famous, and the Indian headdress and the test pattern is actually a famous image all over the world. Everybody knows what that means. So I thought it was a way to talk about both the invisibility and the fact that we're kind of everywhere without any great consequence or meaning at the same time. So the museum project is really about trying to change that. There's a new Smithsonian museum on the National Mall in Washington once a generation. It's a big deal. It's a rare event. And this particular museum is really about changing the way Indian history, culture, contemporary life is understood on a mass level. So it's a pretty big problem.
I suppose part of the problem might be inherent in the museum's name. Might that be an entry point into this discussion?
Yeah, it's kind of a shotgun wedding of sorts, right? It's there's a particular history that's of American Indians. It's embedded in all of these elements. So first of all, we're part of the Smithsonian, the largest and most famous museum complex in the world that has a long, long history with Native people, a checkered history, to be sure. And there's a particular relationship that Indian people have with museums that's pretty singular. Museums are this institution that we're very connected with in a way that I think is pretty unique. Museums obviously have collected huge amounts of our stuff. They've collected the human remains. Our ancestors have been in museums. That's through a process called repatriation that's changing. But there's a very sort of intimate relationship. I know myself and other Indians in the U.S., it's actually not a rare thing to go into a museum and see something behind glass that was owned by, you know, an ancestor or a relative. And that's kind of strange. Museums and anthropology have all been part of have sort of defined who Indians are to the world. So now we have this museum that's sort of for Indians and of Indians as part of the Smithsonian. So that's an interesting contradiction right there. We're a federal museum, in a sense a state museum as part of the federal government. So that obviously has its own contradictions as well. People ask about American Indian and why that instead of Native American. The museum exists primarily because of a collection that became available in the 1980s, and that museum in New York was called the Museum of the American Indian.
Paul, we've asked people about the second word in the name of the museum, the word national. You're talking about some inherent contradictions, and we've asked people what kinds of contradictions might be inherent in the word national, and we're getting some interesting answers. Angela points out that national usually implies a unified identity. Is that a contradiction and one that you've dealt with at the museum?
Yeah, it's a common idea. The other part that's sort of confusing about national is that we actually are a hemispheric museum. So even though we're part of the U.S. government and in Washington, D.C., our purview isn't just the United States, it's the Americas. So we actually are an international museum. That's similar in the way there's a National Museum of African Art in the U.S. But it is confusing, and I think that's a good point, that it implies a cohesive single identity. In this case, either as part of the U.S. or that all Indians are basically, similar in most ways.
Actually, and Edna echoes that. She says, "What nation? What about the sovereignty of the various Native American tribes?" Thank you, Edna. Barbara points out or asks, who owns the earth to determine a nation when the Native Americans were a nation themselves?
One of the protocols of the museum is to relate to Indian political entities as sovereigns, as sovereign nations, and to work directly with tribal governments as well as other communities. But obviously that's, an inherent contradiction of it being, a federal institution and then working with Indian political entities as well.
I'm going to take Scott's question, and then we'll talk about one more of the words in the title, and then actually see how you are addressing this at the museum. Scott says, if a stereotype agrees with how an individual wishes to be perceived, is it still a stereotype? And if so, why does the government want to change it?
Well, some of the stereotypes are actually quite flattering to us. So one of the stereotypes is that we're environmentalists and revere the earth, and another stereotype would be that we're spiritual and have wisdom that maybe others don't have. So it's interesting that when the stereotype is that we're primitive and backward, we're pretty vocal about that. Maybe we're a little bit less vocal about the flattering stereotypes. But they all serve kind of the same purpose, which is to say there are these essentialized qualities to Indian people that all Indian people share. And ultimately, I think it's part of disempowering us, like any stereotypes. So the part of the mission of the museum is to try to change that, and it's a very long-term project, but in a sense it's the idea that we're just plain folks and not inherently endowed with these special qualities that other people don't have.
Paul, as we talk about the last part of the name of the museum, American Indian, we've asked people what is the difference between using the terms American Indian and Native American, and I know that's something that the museum deals with on a regular basis, is that use of that term. How would you respond to that question yourself?
Well, I said earlier that the museum is hemispheric, but sadly I am not. So I come at things from a U.S. perspective, and in other parts of the Americas, it's a different and complex issue as to what those terms mean. American Indian, Native American, First Nations in Canada, many things. So I could just talk about the question that I get a lot, which is people genuinely wanting to just say the right thing and not offend, which is Native American correct? Is American Indian correct? And the fact is most Indian folks in the U.S. use the term Indian, but nobody's offended, or very few people are offended by Native American. When possible, it's preferable to use the the tribal names, so Comanche or Cheyenne or something. But it's sort of a telling example of how little most Americans know about us, that the conversation begins with something as basic as that.
People are saying things like American Indian makes me think of Columbus and his search of the Indies, whereas Native American refers to people born in perhaps North America. Lorraine says, hi Lorraine, from Newton, Massachusetts. I'm not sure, but it seems that I have somehow learned to use the term Native American and picked it up over time. And Kyla says, since my history teacher is part Cheyenne, we're taught to use Native American. He's very offended by the word Indian.
We've actually, through the process of doing exhibitions at the museum, you could see in some cases community members come visit us to work on an exhibit, and they would never use the term Native, and when they left they would be using the term Native. So it's not that we're proselytizing for that, but I mean it shows in a way how fluid those things are.
Let's take a look at this image, and I think this sort of gets us into the problem solving that went into developing the National Museum of the American Indian. Who are we looking at here, and how does he fit into the story?
This is, without this guy, I wouldn't be sitting here in this strange, poorly lit room in a basement in Washington, D.C., working for the Smithsonian. George Gustav Hie, it's spelled H-E-Y-E, but pronounced Hie. He was an investment banker in the early part of the 20th century whose father got in on the first great oil strike by John D. Rockefeller. And so Hie was someone who was wealthy and not so into investment banking. And over several decades in the 20th century built the greatest single intact collection of Indian material. He wasn't professionally trained, and he just amassed this huge amount of stuff. So in the exhibition that I worked on about history, I included a portrait of Hie because I felt it was important for visitors to understand kind of the backstory of the museum, that museums don't just magically appear. And so here was somebody who collected this material, who was sort of mysterious, a mysterious figure in some ways. No one quite knew why this consumed his life so much. He seemed to love our stuff more than us, more than most people that he knew. And by sort of accident of being extremely wealthy, he was able to create this giant collection. Another image of Hie, and he did, you know, have connections with Native people, but he really was interested in the old stuff. He wasn't interested in what we were up to. He wasn't interested in policy or anything like that. In many ways, when we talk about invisibility or from the margins to the center, the marginalization is another way to talk about wealth and power. So why does, you know, this guy George Hie end up with so much of our stuff? You know, how does that happen? And so that becomes another part of a discussion about colonization, about wealth, and how all these amazing works came from graves, you know, ruins, or from communities in which you would go in and buy things and people would sell it for a lot of different reasons, but often because they needed the money. So I always think it's important to talk about the museum in terms of its own creation story, and that's George Hie.
So I think perhaps we have a question here from Ned that might be an interesting segue. Of course, I had the question from Ned, and I think I might have put it into the chat for us to see a moment ago. But how does, and we'll take a look at a little bit more about the history. How do we go from someone like Hie to the National Museum of American Indian? I know there were a couple of contenders for the collection.
Yeah, those images up now. In the 1980s, Hie had passed away, and the collection itself was no longer working in its location in uptown Manhattan. So Ross Perot, who ran for president in the last century, was somebody very eager to acquire the collection. The Smithsonian was interested, and the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So there was this really extremely competitive race to see who would end up with the collection. So it wasn't preordained that the Smithsonian would end up with it. So again, that's sort of the role of politics in creating the collection.
Excuse me, it was Dina Ned. Sorry, Dina. I think the terms used to define a country's original people is directly linked to stereotypes and colonization and assimilation, and says, so how do we change the dialogue in our communities? And maybe as we look at the breaking ground photo here of the museum, and you can talk a little bit about how you tried to do that.
Yeah. The museum tries to do that through programming and exhibitions, and again, it goes back to this idea: is what is the Indian story? This thing that for most Americans they really don't know very much about. So in schools, people usually stop learning about Indians right after Columbus, for example. So the difficulty, the problem my team had to solve in the exhibitions is how to talk about what we call the big story of Indians. And the difficult part is that, you know, the view we put forward, which is not a exotic view, is that contact in 1492 actually changed the world, and that Indians are at the center of this process that really created the world that we live in. That prior to 1492, there were these two halves of the planet that weren't connected. So you're talking about change with humans and political conditions, but also microbes and animals in a really profound way. So it's a challenging notion to put forward when people are expecting this to be much more about learning about a culture group or learning about, you know, particular objects. And in essence, it's saying that this story is really about everyone and not just about Indians, that it explains how you ended up, your life ended up, because it was changed by contact, even if you're a tourist from Beijing just visiting Washington that afternoon.
We've asked the question of our colleagues online with us from around the world, what kind of decisions might they have to make? And some of our participants are curators, but if you were a curator and you were building a museum called the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, or designing the exhibits that it contained, what kinds of decisions would you have to make? Andrew jumped right in, and he joins us from Alaska, saying, whose voice is being presented? Whose story is it? And how is it being told?
Yeah, that gets really to the heart of the core values that form the museum, which, because again, being people defined so much by others, by museums, by anthropology, by non-Indians, by collectors like Gustav Hie, it was very important to allow visitors to hear directly from Native people. So that's important value, and certainly when we try to carry out, what are the difficulties in that? Well, we're just in the U.S., you're talking about 500 different tribes at the least, hemispherically thousands. And so even if you had every museum on the National Mall about Indians, you couldn't really tell all of their stories. You could tell just a handful. So in our Washington Museum, we have 24 community spaces where tribal members from different groups around the hemisphere have voice. And it was a radical direction, because it gave the community members a lot of power in the exhibitions. But what about all the communities you leave out? There was an idea of rotating exhibitions, and we've done that a little bit. But it really points out, no matter what you do, it's going to be limited. If you do an exhibition on the Cherokee of North Carolina, well, a lot of Cherokees live in Oklahoma and have their own tribal government, and they don't feel represented necessarily by the Cherokee in North Carolina. So it points out the immensity and complexity of what we're up against. And the museum has learned a lot since we opened in 2004 about the limitations of that approach. So then you go with a bigger kind of story, but maybe you lose the first person voice, you know, then you have another set of challenges.
I'm going to put the question we've asked about your set of challenges about telling the story of the Americas in about 3,000 square feet over to the top left for people to ponder a bit. And we're looking here at a model of the museum, an architectural model. You know what, let's take a quick look at just what some of the exhibit spaces looks like. You can tell us what we're looking at. Then I want to switch gears a little bit and ask people to think about some of the stereotypes that they might have learned. What are we looking at here, Paul?
Well, this is part of a wall that you see in the fourth floor gallery called Our Peoples Giving Voice to Our Histories. So one of the things I was interested in was talking about what visitors knew coming in and what we can talk about that's important for them to know that might be different. So one issue is a vast amount of wealth in the Americas. And so we show these very rare objects, which are what we call red gold, indigenous gold, in the form that it was created in before contact. And that gold, as you move along the glass wall, you see European money made of gold that actually was from gold taken from the Americas. So it's part of this story of this extraordinary transfer of wealth that occurred after 1492 that turned Europe from kind of a backwater to, the superpower, of that millennium. So the very idea that there was a huge amount of wealth of gold, silver, tin, and that had such a huge impact that it made Spain a superpower is something people don't necessarily normally think about, of the Americas having huge wealth. We talked about the idea, one of the challenging notions was that there weren't any Indians in the Americas in 1491. Even though in the Americas there were arguably as many people here as in Europe at that time. We argue in the exhibition, we didn't think of ourselves as Indians in any way, and that we were as distinct from each other as Egyptians from Zulus in Africa. And so, and yet we're confronted with similar forces over time. So we constructed a set of 3 walls that talk about 3 forces that kind of made us Indians. How did we become Indians and in fact have things in common? And so we decided guns and Christianity and governments that were not our own were 3 forces that Indians from, South America through the Arctic all encountered, all know very well. And we talk about how Christianity, for example, this wall of Bibles in indigenous languages, that none of these things are black and white. So you're looking at the amount of effort it takes to translate the Bible into all of these languages, hundreds and hundreds of indigenous languages. And also how many Native people made Christianity their own, and it became a force of survival. My grandfather was a minister for the Comanche Reformed Church, for example, and that's a very common story. So we wanted to make all of these complicated. With the guns, there are guns that became very Indian-looking, made of walrus bone and things like that, adapted. And so that becomes the story about survival through intelligence, through ingenuity, coping with these massive forces.
Paul, let's take a look at this. We have a number of people who are already starting to ask questions to get to the heart of some stereotypes they believe they might carry with them. And perhaps we can start by asking people what they learned about American Indians or other native peoples, perhaps from where they live. We've got people from all over the world, so it may not just be about Native Americans or American Indians. But go ahead in the box on the left. Tell us about what you learned. What did you learn? And if you're in school right now, what have you learned if you think back over the course of your own learning experience? And you can type that in the box on the left. And I'm wondering how many of the things that come up in this box as we speak, Paul, are at once accurate and common conceptions that you deal with at the museum. So we'll see what people have to say. And I'm also going to put up a second box on the screen to give people a chance to indicate perhaps what they didn't learn, if you have some thoughts on that as well. Chris says, unfortunately, he learned from the European perspective first. And Mark says, as a child, sorry to say it, but it was Thanksgiving costumes and stereotypes. Sonia says, surprisingly, very little, as does Pat. Deirdre jumps in and says, the Cherokees were intelligent and had their own written language. They divided along the lines of assimilation and non-assimilation. Someone is shocked at some of her old textbooks that she's finding these days. Things that people haven't learned are things like, okay, we have some very specific questions about financial systems and currencies. but really nothing about culture, traditions, and customs. Paul is looking intently at all of your dialogue here, and he's kind of giving a knowing nod, and I'm wondering what you're thinking right now.
Well, it's a very big topic, and I guess I'm always trying to avoid the idea that there's just a certain set of facts or easy things to understand. I think it's really about encouraging critical thinking and a deeper understanding of history, a large history, so that Indians are not seen as just a thing you go out and learn about, but part of understanding, you know, American history and world history. And so that becomes a much more ambitious question. In a sense, think about if we asked this poll question, you know, in let's say 1935, and we had all these computers and Microsoft and all that. And you ask, what do people know about African Americans? Well, they wouldn't know what African Americans were, first of all. But you know, if you think about how much American society has changed in terms of understanding the African American experience is central to the American experience, American history. That's the sort of leap that we see in the next few decades, as outlandish as that might be, so that people now understand, you know, school kids are learning, you know, African Americans aren't something you learn about just during the Civil War, but it's something that's key to understanding the American experience. Right now, Indians are something that's in the past, and what we're thinking about are strategies so that it's understood as, in a similar way, crucial to understanding history.
There are a number of comments that relate to the sort of lumping together of native peoples, and one question emerges for you, Paul, from Beatrice, who says, do American Indians from North America feel connected to native peoples of Central and South America? If so, how? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Beatrice is joining us from South America.
I would say on sort of a rhetorical or romantic sense, the answer is yes. I think most Indians in the U.S. don't really have that much connection with Indians in Latin America, except that here in Washington, D.C., for example, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Mayan Indians here, except we don't really see them as Mayan Indians because they're you know, day laborers or gardeners or something like that. We see them as Latin American immigrants. Some of them even, you know, are not that fluent in Spanish and speak their own languages. So it's another kind of invisibility. I think there's curiosity, but I think it would be an overstatement to say there's strong ties, you know, between Latin American folks and Indians in the U.S. and Canada.
This is a really interesting comment from Glenn, and then we're going to take another step in this process as we think about this. Glenn says, most learning regarding Indians is about how they interact with settlers, broader society, but very little about them independently as nations.
Yeah, that was an opportunity for us in a section called 1491 to really talk about you know, the vastness of the Americas and talk about empires, for example, in a way that isn't trying to be romantic about them, but in a sense, you know, our notion was every kind of good and bad thing humans are capable of happened in the Americas, that it wasn't some idyllic paradise. And I think it's an important idea. I think certainly some people, certainly a lot of Indian folks would prefer to believe that, you know, it was kind of perfect in its own way, and maybe some bad things happened, but, you know, slavery certainly existed before contact, and I think, you know, humans are much more alike than different. So trying to get at something where everything isn't about Indians and settlers, you know, is something that's very hard. There's almost no situation of the U.S. government and Indians that didn't also involve multiple conflicts and alliances among different Indian groups. It was almost never, the government versus this Indian tribe. It always had to do with this very complex geopolitical situation. And that's hugely lost. It's another kind of sort of white supremacy, is that the only thing that's important about Indians is when we're in conflict with settlers.
Let's take a look at some stereotypes and how you address them in the exhibit. And I'm curious how many of these are actually things that people listed among what they learned or didn't learn. Okay, so we think visitors think that the Americas were mostly empty. How do you address that?
The recent scholarship in the last couple decades that do talk about tens of millions of people in the Americas, and many experts believe more people in the Americas than in Europe. So that's something most people did not learn in school, and is surprising to most of our visitors.
What about that Indians were kind of backward? And I'm wondering, as we go through each of these, I certainly welcome comments from people who have some perspective on this, or just doing some thinking along with us.
Yeah, I think those got to speak for themselves. Indians are technologically backward, also poor.
We've talked a little bit about this item. Indians have similar cultural beliefs, and you made a reference to the 1491 exhibit as well. Here's there's some interesting comments coming in here, by the way, from Marie and from Jenny, talking about sustainable technology. Is that a myth or a reality? Terms of, you talked a little bit about Native Americans' closeness to the land, or being the first environmentalists.
Yeah, we did amazing stuff with agriculture and technology. I think the stereotype comes in which it's saying that we always did that, and we never engaged in practices that were destructive, to the environment. So there's amazing agricultural techniques that are actually being studied by non-Indians as being really advanced and appropriate. Corn was a great example of that, of something that didn't just exist in the world, but was actually created over generations by what isn't a stretch to call native scientists. And so that's another example of people doing amazing inventive things.
What do you say to Catherine, who says, how do we teach about Native Americans and avoid promoting stereotypes? For example, was it a good or bad idea for my third grade teacher to have us make totem poles, which use traditional figures?
I'm old school, so I'd have to say it's almost always a bad idea. I think but the fact is, I think as an educational institution, we have to look at meeting people where they are. So the fact that people are interested in Indians, know something about totem poles, I think then the issue is how to turn that into something that doesn't just affirm stereotypes, but tries to deconstruct them or lead to something that's a little bit more complicated.
We have a question about gender stereotypes and how you, as a curator or the museum in general, address this. For example, Marie says the word squaw as a stereotype, that Indian women are available to white men, as she puts it.
Yeah, one of many really ugly stereotypes that still exist.
What about this one here? Thanksgiving celebrates the time when Indians and pilgrims watched NFL football together over turkey and nachos.
I've always liked Thanksgiving. I mean, it's a nice secular American holiday, basically. So if it didn't have anything to do with Indians, it would be one of my favorite, after Christmas.
What about this comment? This is the most depressing exhibit ever. Also, where did those glass beads come from anyway? We had a question a little earlier that kind of gets to this about whether you guys at the museum see any correlation between how, for example, a museum like the Holocaust Museum here in Washington treat their subject matter.
Yeah, the Holocaust Museum was a huge influence for my team when we began working on the history exhibit in 2002. I admire it tremendously. The crucial difference is that museum is only about the Holocaust, and NMAI is about about Native people from really the beginning of time to today. So if there was, and maybe there should be, a museum of Native genocide, that would be a very different experience than what NMAI is. The other difference is that most visitors are familiar with at least the outlines of the Holocaust, and it's a relatively recent event, quite different than our situation where there's so much exposition that you have to do.
What are we looking at here?
That's the 1491 wall, where to sort of demonstrate the idea of massive diversity and massive numbers, a sort of crowded wall of pre-contact figurines that don't really look, very few of them look what most people would say is identifiably Indian. Many of them look like they're from Asia or Africa or Europe. So it was really trying to get across how diverse the Americas were pre-contact.
Now, for people who go to museums often, they might see this and wonder where the labels are. Are there labels for this?
When we opened, there weren't labels, and that was deliberate. There was a description of saying what they were generally. But we actually wanted to... We didn't want people to treat this part of the museum as an ethnological experience. And we wanted to focus, on the way we're telling the story. So to have people look at a label that uses this is a culture group and this is when it was made, we think, and this is what the purpose was, then that detracted from what we were trying to get at. I think now there is that information there. A lot of it is vague and, in my opinion, not necessarily that useful, but it is there. I never had the idea that people would believe what we said in this exhibition, because I felt like so much of it was going to be quite challenging. If it's a brand new idea that there were more people in the Americas than in Europe in 1491, and a new idea that the transfer of wealth from the Americas to Europe made Europe a superpower in part, and that the biological catastrophe was the greatest in human history and wiped out 90% of it, and that's all within the first 40 feet of the exhibit. If you're not familiar with those ideas, you're hearing this for the first time in your whole life. You've either never heard about it or heard things that contradicted it. I think you'd have to be a pretty simple person to say, oh, it's in a museum, now I agree with it. So cognitive dissonance is this term that I think speaks to that question. So let's talk about Thanksgiving for a second. So if you grow up believing Thanksgiving was this pretty cool and good-natured feast between natives and pilgrims, and maybe it's exaggerated, maybe it's sort of myth, but it's sort of mostly true, then you read in our exhibition, or you see on the History Channel, or you read many books about it that really show that some of these pilgrims, some of them famous, actually did rob graves, Indian graves, for corn. That doesn't quite compute. That's kind of complicated. That changes, the investment that you have in a certain idea of the country, one of the founding myths of the country. So those things are hard. I think this basic premise of saying Indian experience is central. How can it be central if you never hear about it? How can it be important? You know, how can it really be affecting your life? You know, so I think that's what we're trying to address. Some of it was in the visual strategy for the exhibition, where we have curved walls and changing lights and things that are not necessarily straight ahead, maybe a little bit disorienting. Is another way to enter that conversation.
People are sharing some moments of cognitive dissonance in the window in the center, and thank you all for, in some cases, reaching deep and sharing publicly. We have some fun ones, like someone from Milford Middle School saying, "I love chocolate, but I know it will go straight to my thighs." Mm-hmm. We have questions about whether capitalism is a blessing or a curse, and presumably somebody enjoying the benefits but feeling some of the guilt, perhaps. Joanne says wanting to make the house warmer while thinking of the chimps in their shrinking forests. And we're looking through some of these many responses. Dina, wanting self-determination but relying on federal funding. I hope you're having a chance to scroll through some of the responses of your fellow participants here. This sort of myth of the independent Westerner. So how does knowing about cognitive dissonance, Paul, help us confront stereotypes? Or change them?
I think the way to think about stereotypes is as a condition and not as a list of things that are true or false, or things that are polite to say or impolite to say, or things that can be fixed just by reading a book or going to a museum. That some of these ideas, you know, they go back 500 years and they're incredibly powerful. You know, the Pocahontas story, for example, and the latest Disney version, and some would say Avatar is another version of that. You know, these things are like genius stories that are crafted brilliantly over time, and they're able to shapeshift, you know, in different eras. So it's kind of silly to be, you know, shaking your finger at people and saying, oh, well, that's incorrect and these aren't the facts of it. It's more about what needs do those ideas serve? How do they fit into the national myth? What role do Native people play in those stereotypes? I'll give you an example. Iroquois patriot leaders in the mid-20th century, they set up their organization, and at public events, and I think in their materials, they would have their leaders wear feathered headdresses from the plains. They knew very well this wasn't traditional Iroquois clothing or material. They had their own kinds of feathered headdresses that were very different, but they used that strategically because they knew the audience they were looking at was more familiar with Plains Indian material than traditional Iroquois material. So we play a role in these things. You know, our actors, you know, are part of these projects that may be stereotypical. So it isn't, we're not innocent of this. We're part of it. And I think it's more about looking at tougher questions about what role that serves, who benefits and why, and how that's part of a story about history that, you know, to some degree we're all writing.
We had a question which might lead us into a good place to begin to wrap up our discussion today. A question about how you present Native Americans and in an ever-changing museum climate where you're keeping things fresh. And I thought maybe looking at the work of Brian Youngin might be a place to conclude.
Yeah, this is an artist who lives in Vancouver named Brian Youngin. He's in his 30s for I think another few weeks or something. And he's been commercially and critically successful at shows all around the world, and we have a show of his work right now in Washington. There was that reference earlier to a question we get all the time: where did you guys get the beads? Where did you get these glass beads? And what's behind that is this idea, well, we know you guys didn't make glass, so obviously you got them from some other place, so haha, you know, you're fake. That's how I see it anyway. So there's a way that we're conflated with the objects. We're conflated with the materials that were frozen in the past. So that if you're an Indian artist, you have to work with, with feathers, with leather, with beads. And in a sense, it's the trap of Indian people today, which is if you're not authentic by the terms of these stereotypes, that you have to observe your culture in a certain way, you have to speak your language, you have to perform ceremonies, you have to live on your ancestral homelands, then somehow you're not legitimately Indian. So we have in the case of Brian Young and many other stellar contemporary artists, people who basically have no patience for those rules and make work, in the case of Brian Young, and work that is made out of consumer objects. Nike Air Jordans, most famously, that become Northwest Coast Indian masks, or this piece called The Prince, made out of baseball gloves, that is interestingly sort of echoes the Statue of Freedom on top of the U.S. Capitol, which is quite near our building. So it raises this question: can Indian artists make work out of completely non-Indian material? How is it Indian? And some people would say, even in our museum, well, it isn't. It isn't Indian art. If you go to the store and buy Nike Air Jordans and cut them up and make them into fake masks, that's cool. We like that discussion. But we think it's an interesting strategy to get at the same question the history exhibition does, which is, what does it mean to be Indian today? How is it relevant to other people, and how are we still in the contemporary world today? The image that's up now is an acquisition called Crux, that's in the rotunda of our museum in Washington. It's made from luggage in the shape of these animals. There's a boat and then these 5 animals from Australia that Brian made when he was doing a project for the Sydney Biennial, 2008.
What did you say this one's made out of?
Luggage. So he was in this island that was right by the Sydney airport, so there were planes flying over. So in this case, whale skeleton made from cheap white plastic chairs, like patio chairs, that you buy for $5 at Home Depot.
And you can see a close-up there, some recognizable parts from your summer barbecues. So are we supposed to, when we look at this, among other things, have a sense of cognitive dissonance as we confront a stereotype? Thinking about, as someone put it earlier, a sense about capitalism and perhaps imperialism, together with images that might be a bit contradictory to what we're looking at there?
I think it's pretty open-ended work. I think one can look at it a lot of times. There's not a literal political message in it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people read things into it because Brian is native, that the artist may not have intended. I think it can go a lot of places.
Well, Anne Claire says that in art, cognitive dissonance can be fun rather than disturbing at times, which is true. And one thing that I'm glad you finished on the work of Brian Young, because it does show in one way how you are working on confronting stereotypes in an interesting way in your work at the museum. And we thank you for sharing your time with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
We invite all of you to stay right where you are. We've also put up a little button where you can give us some feedback about the session and continued questions that you have as we plan future programs on this topic. This is just one question of many that can be asked while looking at the work and stories that come out of the National Museum of the American Indian, and we hope you'll share some feedback in our evaluation link at the top left. Take a 5-minute break. You can stay right where you are. And coming up next, a session that hopefully won't give you nightmares, but I know will keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned for our session on what can science tell us about American history. And we've got bone experts with us today, and we're going to look at some amazing images and some untold stories. Stay with us.